Apeejay Kolkata Literary Festival, celebrating a decade of literary excellence. We would like to begin our event for now, Café Litteraire, Still the Second Sex, inspired the famous French writer Simone de Beauvoir, who laid the foundation for the modern feminist movement. Her famous book, The Second Sex, established her as one of the most important feminist icons of the era. We are having with us an esteemed panelist, which includes Ms. Ruchira Gupta, the founder of Apne Aap Women Worldwide, a grassroots organization in India working to end sex trafficking by increasing choices for at-risk girls and women. In 2009, Ms. Gupta won the Clinton Global Citizen Award, and in 2007, she won the Abolitionist Award at the UK House of Lords. We also have with us Ms. Paromita Chakravarti, a professor in the Department of English at the Jadavpur University, and she has been at School of Studies, Jadavpur University. She has published widely on Shakespeare and early modern studies in Renaissance studies. We are still waiting on Mr. Saikat Majumdar, so as he comes in, we should allow him and welcome him once again. So thanking everyone, I hope we can start our discussions for today with a round of applause for our panelists.
This is sort of a panel where, we've been rushing at breakneck speed to make it here on time and to start on time. But I think it's worth the effort because we are celebrating today 70 years of The Second Sex, Simone de Beauvoir's book, which in its time was revolutionary, came out in 1949 in 2 volumes. And in many ways, the book has remained with us, its meaning probably is not the same as it was in that sort of post-war France, when the world was what it was. We live in very different times. We've achieved as women, big strides have been made, huge changes have been made in women's lives. But at the same time, I think the book remains with us and keeps sort of yielding new meanings to us in ways which often surprise us. And it remains sort of relevant despite the fact that it's sort of 70 years old now. When we were in college, I remember reading it as as a kind of feminist classic, and with great excitement and with great joy. And I still see my students doing the same 30 years later. Discovering things in it, discovering their own lives in it. So I'd just like to sort of kickstart the discussion, and I do hope that the audience will jump in and ask questions and have comments, and we'll have time enough for that, which is why both Ruchira and I are rushing to get started so that everybody gets a chance to talk. So Ruchira, I'll just sort of begin by, because we don't really have a moderator, so we are going to moderate it ourselves. So we are both panelists and moderator. So Ruchira is probably going to ask me questions. I'm going to ask her questions. So Ruchira, I'm just going to begin by asking, how do you see, what do you see as a sort of centrally important tenet, let's say, which has remained with us and which continues to inspire us of the book? If I were to say, what in the book, jumps at you and seems very relevant, because I ask you this question, knowing that in the morning we were having this discussion about, that central sort of observation which we always talk about, which is one is not born a woman but becomes one. So, yeah.
Actually, to be more accurate, I would like to quote exactly from the French translation. Also, I would like to invite people who are on the left. There are plenty of chairs here. Some of you could just come across the front seats and walk there. I'll pause for a second while you do that. So, yes, there's room here. So basically, to begin with Paromita's question, that what is the importance of Simone de Beauvoir? The book, The Second Sex, was printed in 1949, and here we are 60 years later talking about it. What did it do for us? And just today I posted on Facebook that besides Karl Marx's Das Kapital and Rousseau's The Social Contract, I don't think any other book has challenged inequality in the same way. Very clearly, what Simone de Beauvoir has done is challenge the most fundamental of all inequalities, which is the inequality at home. Because it is at home that when we are born, we see that hierarchy and inequality is okay. we see that it's all right for one class of human beings, male human beings, to order, and another class of human beings to obey. That is the female human being. And that is how we begin to normalize inequality, because we think this is the norm. And that is what Simone de Beauvoir challenged through her writings at a very young age, and at a time when we did not have any concept called women's rights. We did not have the voting right. There was no adult suffrage for women, universal suffrage, the way we take for granted. There were no women's studies centers in universities. There was no theory around feminism at all. And this is a time when Simone de Beauvoir puts forward something saying that there is something when we talk about class inequality, we have to talk about sex inequality. And she says we can see this very clearly, and we have to challenge male cultural hegemony. This is the most fundamental of the things that she said. And of course, the quote that Paromita quoted, I want to quote it very exactly, because a comma or an article makes the world of difference, you know, when you're translating from French to English. So what she said is, one is not born, but rather becomes woman. Rather becomes woman. She didn't say a woman, becomes woman. What did she mean by that? She said it's a category like class where you can become rich or poor. So you can be genderized, you can be made unequal to become a woman. And why unequal when we talk about inequality? Why does she say a woman itself, essentially the way you are naturalized into it to become a woman? Why is it unequal? She says we are confined in 3 ways in her book, In the Second Sex. And she says, of course, there's the physical confinement, you know, and we know about that in our country today now, that we say that, oh, did you go out at night? Is that why you were raped? And there's a famous rape case in Park Street, the very place that we are talking about, when a woman went to a nightclub and she was raped. And many politicians in the city actually said that, you know, what was she doing out at night? So confinement can be physical. It can be intellectual. So we can be told what a woman should think, what a good woman thinks, what a bad woman thinks, how we dress, how we speak, how we smile even. And in fact, it makes women compete with each other in how we smile and how can we get male approval. Because we think male approval then becomes a pathway to power rather than having our own power to channelize the power through the man that we get, whose approval we get. And in that too, Simone has a beautiful quote, which I want to just mention, which is that she has been taught to overestimate her smile. But no one told her that all women smile. So each of us think, if I can smile, if I can be coquettish, I can get associated with male power. But what if we realize that all women smile and we can actually get more power by connecting with each other as a whole and do things collectively? So this is Simone quintessentially. Another very quintessential moment in her writings was that she writes about the fact about a woman making jam. And she says the woman labeled the date on top of the jam jar. And what did she write about that act of putting the date on top of the jam jar? She says that the girl making jam with the date on the lid, she has captured the passage of time in the snare of sugar. So what is imprisonment? What is confinement? So there's intellectual, there's physical, and there's psychological. And this is what Simone challenges in every page of this. Of course, Mary Wollstonecraft was her predecessor, and then there is Simone, and now we have so many more feminist writers. Calcutta is full of them. You know, Mahashweta Di wrote incessantly, Nobonita Debsen, Gayatri Spivak is from the city, Malini Bhattacharya. We have had many, Yashodhara Bagchi, how could I not talk about, in Calcutta on feminism without mentioning them, who have then talked about the feminizing of poverty. And today we can connect the feminizing of poverty, that 28% women are dropping out of the workforce. Women have jobs which pay less even today after 60 years of our struggle, when we have the vote, when we have rights embedded in our constitution about equality for women. But yet, you know, women get paid less. Women do not get jobs in decision making as much as men do. How many female judges are there? how many presidents of countries are there, how many editors of newspapers are there. I come from a journalism background, so I always have to question this. We still have the casting couch. We have heard story after story of the Me Too movement. And of course, the backlash to the Me Too movement is something called himpathy. What is himpathy? Does anyone know this? Has anyone heard this word before? It's the inordinate sympathy that men who are accused of sexually assaulting and harassing women, the men who are accused of being part of perpetrators in the Me Too movement, the men get this sympathy, so we call it himpathy. Because how come they get more sympathy than the women who are the victims? And how come we focus on that one case of false accusation or over accusation when there are dozens and thousands and millions of women in workplaces who are being paid, harassed, there are with sexist comments. Sometimes it's not even, just sexual. It doesn't need to be body penetration every time. It can be sexual harassment in so many different sexist ways. Jokes, destruction of self-confidence of a woman at work by commenting on her clothes, by giving her less work, making her feel shameful or guilty about certain acts. Just imagining, even projecting that she knows less, will deliver less, can do less. So all these are issues that now we can put a vocabulary to, and we can talk about, thanks to the fact that someone opened our eyes to it like 60 years ago, and that was Simone de Beauvoir. And that is why the second sex and our understanding of this power inequality begins with this seminal book that we are talking about today. And I'm so glad that we are doing it in the Alliance. The one award when I was being introduced today, which was left out, was that, the French government was kind enough to give me the Chevalier. And I was happy because it was from the country which had produced Simone de Beauvoir. And Paromita, I have a question for you. You teach young students, and very often, I come across young students saying, "Ma'am, I don't want to be a feminist. I'm not a feminist." And then even women forget men. And when I ask them that, why don't you want to be a feminist and why are you not a feminist? So the women say that we might not get married. We are not the kind of people who don't like men. We want to have boyfriends. And how do you respond to such women?
It's a very interesting question, and it has sort of several aspects to it. I think, there's both. Among my students, since you sort of located the question in young people, I think it's the same with older people. A lot of them are activists, but wouldn't really sort of identify with feminism in a direct kind of way as an identity. But then there are also a lot of male students, female students, who very, very easily use the word feminism. I have a problem with both. And I think, being almost embarrassed to call oneself a feminist, we often criticize that. But also, the word feminism seems to sort of slip so easily off our tongues now that we very often don't even understand what it means and what it entails, because it's not an easy label to carry. And it's also a complex kind of politics. It's sort of, I think what Simone alerted us to, and I think that is one of the abiding values of the book, is this struggle that one has to, I think just as one is not born a woman but becomes one, similarly one is not born a feminist but becomes one. And it is a very, very complex, difficult struggle. And very often you don't want to become one. Very often you become one and then you don't know what to do with it. So I think for me, when I go back and read the book now, there are many things. I think there's a lot of feminist critique of the book, from the vantage point that we are now at. And it's easy to critique the book because we have won several victories. It's difficult to understand a time when things were not that easy. But I think she struggled so hard. And if you look at the trajectory of her life, she died when she was 78, so it's a long life. And she started off in a certain way. And for me, what is interesting is to read The Second Sex along with her very, very detailed autobiographies. So she has 4 volumes of really fat, thick autobiographies. And in the autobiographies, she's really scrutinizing herself. And she's really sort of interrogating, where she's at, what she's doing, what her politics are, how her politics are changing given the changing times. And I think it's interesting that when she wrote The Second Sex, she very clearly said it's not a feminist book. And now you look back on it and you think, what is, more feminist than this? But she very clearly said that this is not a feminist book. I'm not a feminist. So she was one of those students. And I think she also said very clearly that I wrote the book because I was actually going to write my autobiography. And then I thought, in order to write my autobiography, I have to think about, who I am. And one of the things that I am is a woman. And I never actually thought about being a woman before I started writing my autobiographies. And she said it was Sartre who actually pointed this out to me and said, what about this identity of being a woman? And she said, I'd never thought about it because since I was 20, I've never really thought myself of a woman because she was highly educated. She went to Sorbonne and that famous story where they had this very difficult examination where Sartre came first and she came second. And she, for me, that I think had a lasting impression on her mind. But we rarely mention the fact that the year before that, Sartre actually failed those exams and she passed in the first instance. And I think the examiners had a very, very difficult job because they constantly were discussing, who should come first. But she always felt that she learned from Sartre, that she was not really a great original philosophical thinker. She always felt that. And that, I think, is, it's part of the problem that she's describing. She's part of the problem she's describing. She, an enormously gifted woman like that, huge intellectual, feels that, she's still learning from the man she's with. When clearly, Sartre himself said several times that she understands philosophers better than I do. She understands philosophy better than I do. She herself wrote in her autobiography that and in many cases, and I find this quite extraordinary, that she said that, this theory of the other that she has in the book, she says, I learned from Sartre, from being in nothingness. Her daughter actually sort of pointed out, saying that she was thinking about this even before she'd met Sartre. And she learned this from Bergson, if she learned it from anybody. So I think those kinds of implications that we have, even as she's critiquing this hegemony, this cultural hegemony, she's part of that cultural hegemony, and she's very much a part of that system, and constantly, sort of putting Sartre before her. So I think that's interesting, and I think this whole, but she really changes. She changes remarkably, I think, through her life, and I think that's the most exciting thing about The Second Sex, because for me it's a growing text, because it's a text. It's also a text that, and I'd just like to talk about this a little bit because, of course, it was translated in the early 50s into English, and that's the translation we all read. So it was done by a man called Parshley, Professor Parshley, who was this, I think, biology professor or a zoology professor, who didn't really probably get a lot of the things that Simone was talking about. And now we know that perhaps he translated only 10% of the text of the French text. So in 2010, this new and enlarged and improved edition translation came out. And we now know that, what we read as The Second Sex was really a tenth of the book, probably, that Simone wrote. So anyway, so I think it's interesting that the text is also dynamic. It is growing. We are seeing new things in the text. The text is, probably a slightly newer version than we had read before, and I think through that dynamism we constantly see Simone herself changing, and I think that's extraordinary. That she's writing this in 1949. She's writing the book, and she's saying very clearly, I didn't even realize I was a woman before Sartre pointed this out to me. And she said that the first 20 years of my life, maybe I was brought up in a sort of petit bourgeois, Catholic family, and I was not allowed to do many things. So, maybe there was some sense in my being a girl or my gender was important. But since I was 20, since I got my baccalaureate, and since I was, in academics, I felt like a man. I mean, I have been able to do pretty much everything that a man does. So I don't need to be a feminist, is what she thought. But by the time, the 60s movement had started, Paris 68 had happened, and from the early 1970s, she very clearly identifies with the radical feminist movement. She very clearly thinks of herself as a feminist. And very clearly, she is located in the question of gender. So I think, that remarkable sort of development is what we have to understand, that feminism is a process. Feminism is not an identity that we just sort of inherit or are born into or can just sort of seize and, put on ourselves very easily. I think it's a difficult process. We should acknowledge its difficulty. And I think Simone's life and her relationship with the text teaches us that it's a process. So long answer to short question. And I think also another thing that I want to talk about a little bit is the fact that even when she's talking about feminism, herself as a feminist, she's also constantly, there are these caveats. She's the complexity of that politics, because she came, like many of us did, from a left background. And she's very, when in the late 40s she's writing, she's very clear about the fact that feminism is a question that will come later. The socialist revolution has to come first. But I think she changes that position as well. So it's extraordinary, how she revises her thoughts. So yeah. Sorry, my question to you. Yes. So Saikat still isn't here, so I think we'll have to. Yeah. So no, really what I was thinking about is, how do you sort of see the text as, you are a teacher as well. So do you teach the second sex? Do you, how do younger people react to it? Because we sort of read it in a particular kind of way, but in an academic context, do you see it as a philosophical text? Do you see it as an activist text? Do you see it as a feminist classic? How would you?
I would say all of it. It is a feminist classic, and at the time that Simone wrote this, she did not call herself a feminist. But feminism at that time did not exist. So we have to see people in their context and when they are writing. So this is 1949 when she's publishing. So she's writing this in 1947, 1948. This is, at a period when things are changing in Europe. 1917 is when the first, when Lenin goes to Moscow and presents the April thesis. It's also 1917 on exactly the same day, which probably Simone did not know about. In our own country, Gandhi goes to Champaran and defies British orders to leave the district, saying that I will follow the laws of a higher conscience, that of God, which is to look at the plight of mankind and document the plight of indigo workers. They're on exactly the same day. 17th April 1917, funnily enough, in 2 different continents, 2 different countries. So norms were changing, people were challenging feudalism, people were challenging colonialism. One war was already over, the second was in the middle of going on. In Germany, fascism is rising, the left movement is being, people are being killed by the fascists in Germany just when and in France, of course, France is occupied, resistance is going on, and this is the time when Simone is bold enough to say that besides looking at class inequality, we have to look at sex inequality. And at a time when she has to say that, socialism right now is the bigger struggle, and we will come to the sex struggle later, which she again then goes back and does say that, she becomes part of the tradition of radical feminism. Now, what is radical feminism? Because there is a whole tradition of that. So in this same tradition is Gloria Steinem, radical feminism, right? And you have many radical feminist teachers in Shantiniketan, in Vishwabharati, and Rabindra Bharati. So what is radical feminism? the word radical today, many people think it means extreme. Actually not. It's not extreme, and it's not to say extremist. Radical really, if you look at the dictionary definition of radical, it means going to the root of anything. So what Simone is saying when she's calling herself a radical feminist, and what radical feminists till this day say, is that the root of all inequality is the inequality between the sexes. She says gender digs a trench into our brain into which all other inequalities fall. And I said that right at the beginning of the conversation also, that it's at home that we first realize what inequality is, because we see that it's all right for one class of human beings to order and another to obey, and that's when we normalize inequality. And she goes on, Simone uses a beautiful sentence in The Second Sex, in which she says that, first we cut off her wings, and then we blame her for not flying. So this is what happens to women, because right from the time they are born till the time they die, they're told, don't do this, don't do that, don't sit with your legs apart, laugh quietly, don't laugh with a full-throated laughter, wear your clothes in a certain way, don't be too independent, don't be ambitious. These are things which are taught to us, that ambition is not a good quality, walking freely is not a good quality, being coquettish is good, you'll get more approval that way. So these are things which are gendered, and they're taught to us, which curtail our way of thinking and behaving, which then curtail our ability to realize our full potential as human beings. So basically, what is feminism? Feminism, as Fabrice said, frees men too. Because basically, what does it do? It is actually the definition of feminism from the perspective of radical feminists is the full belief in the full equality of men and women. That's all it is. So men can be feminists too, and women can be feminists too. And why is it radical? Because it begins at home. It is the root of all other inequalities. Because we accept one inequality, then when we go out in society and we see that, somebody is ordering somebody, so we think, oh, ordering is okay. Hierarchy is okay. And that also makes us vulnerable to fascism. This is where they were thinking about that, what is the root cause of fascism? And many philosophers after that have come out with ideas. But look at our country today, India. Look at the United States. Both our countries today are vulnerable to fascism. Why? Both fought colonialism in different ways. The United States fought colonialism with a gun through civil war. India fought colonialism without a gun through civil disobedience. And in both our cultures, we are very committed to the ways we fought colonialism as part of our culture. So India has creative chaos, and we think we will never let it go. We will argue, we will fight, we will create chaos, and we believe it should exist because it helped us fight the British and get rid of colonialism. And similarly, in America, the fight to end gun violence, stop selling guns in malls and shops, it's a very deep fight because the gun helped them win the battle against the British and get rid of colonialism. So they have gun culture and we have a chaotic culture, right? And yet, and one adopted the path to development as capitalism, America, and India adopted the path to development as socialism, Nehruvian socialism. Very different paths. Yet, in both our countries today, we are so vulnerable to fascism when we are fighting for every inch of democratic space. And what is it that we did not tackle? That similar things are happening in both our countries. We did not tackle hierarchy. America, of course, did not tackle the hierarchy of race. We did not tackle the hierarchy of caste. But both race and caste are rooted in sex inequality. Because after all, you need women's bodies to reproduce race or caste. You have to have marriages between two upper caste women to produce an upper caste man to be the heir, or two lower caste people to produce cheap labor. So women became either cheap labor or produced cheap labor in both places, and race and caste were used to perpetuate that. And so those two inequalities were never tackled, and the most fundamental, and the word I use again is radical, inequality was not tackled, which is why we have normalized the idea of hierarchy, and we are looking for a strong man. Because we see in our countries, in both our countries, the head of the family as the strong man who takes the decision. It's normalized. So we think, oh, if we vote in a head of the family as a leader with a big chest, with a big turban, whatever he says, whatever he does, we will be fine. And, we are prone to it. That's how we become vulnerable. What do you think on that, the connection between how we see sex inequality, and how does Simone's text make us understand this and interpret this in today's context?
Thanks, Ruchira, for that question, because even as you were talking, I was constantly thinking about how Simone is constantly evoking other kinds of marginality and other kinds of inequality to understand sex inequality. For instance, one of the things she keeps talking about is slavery, and how to understand sex inequality in terms of the history of slavery. And I think she comes up with this, and she was also, I think, very influenced. You were talking about racism. She was very influenced by Richard Wright around this time, with whom she was having an affair, who actually introduced her to, who was an American left-winger, who introduced her to the idea of race, and who was, I think, instrumental in sort of helping her to think through the idea of race, to understand gender inequality better. And I think, of course, she personally had the other experience, which is the experience of anti-Semitism, living in resistance France under Nazi Germany. So she at that point, I think, living through through those years, I think she had a sort of first-hand experience of what it means, how your identity can become a sort of reason of oppression, and it can actually curb your freedom, etc. So I think those kinds of identities she was toying with, she was trying to understand what it meant in terms of living your life. And I think it is at that point she sort of comes to the idea of gender, and tries to understand gender through all these other lenses of inequality. Anti-Semitism and racism, I think, were very well entrenched within left thought as things that needed to be tackled. That was part of that should become a part of the class struggle. But gender was clearly not. I mean, every revolution could happen, but gender revolution should wait. And of course, when we are free, when we have a classless society, then of course women will be free automatically, because women are human beings, etc., etc. And Simone, I think, at that point realized that that's not going to really happen. And she sort of, her writing the book was a way of, almost alerting her left comrades that, you are talking about all these inequalities, but, look at this. As you said, it's right at home, it's right under your noses, it's something that you practice every day. And live through every day, and create and recreate every day. So I think that was a very important point. And also this question about slavery, because she says that if you look at other kinds of marginality, so if you look at Jews, if you look at black people, if you look at slaves, there is always hope for them, because they can have solidarities through their identities. The problem with women is that they're so divided by class issues, by community issues, by family issues, that it's so difficult for them to come together through that marginalized identity, which they often even don't acknowledge, which she herself didn't acknowledge. So I think it's a very important point she makes, that Jewish identity brings the Jewish people together. The black identity and the experience of racism brings black people together. But the experience of being a woman, you're so divided because you're living in such scattered lives. Because for an upper class woman to feel that solidarity for a poor woman, or a Dalit woman in our case, is always much more difficult than a Jew to sort of identify with another Jew and create a kind of resistance or solidarity. So she said that this is the extra problem that women face, because they are so divided. And the other problem, which I think she was also, and she wrote so powerfully and passionately, because I think she herself was trying to negotiate those issues in her own life. And she says the other problem is the slave doesn't love the master. but for women, their oppressors are the intimate enemy, you know. But of course, she never thought of men as enemies, which I think is a very, very interesting, which is why a lot of radical feminists think that, you know, her analysis of patriarchy didn't go far enough, because, you know, very often she was talking about a collaborative change where men would be participants in that change. So I think that distinction that she makes, that, you know, because we love our oppressors, it makes that struggle that much more difficult. And that's why, even though we are enslaved, even though we are like black people, even though we are like Jews, we are not quite like them. And our struggle is more difficult. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think she gave us the vocabulary to begin to further analyze our situation. And, you know, after Simone comes Malcolm X, who defines how a house slave would differ from a field slave. So when the house is burning, Malcolm X says the house slave will try to put the fires out because he's also living inside the house. Whereas the field slave will say, let the house burn. So it's exactly like the situation of a woman who is with a man that she loves him, but she wants her freedom, but how does she negotiate it? And that kind of struggle that, you know, and there have been other radical feminists who have followed from Simone's time, who have written very good books on this. For those who are interested, The Demon Lover by Robin Morgan. And to take off from what Paromita said, that, you know, how she was always looking for solidarity, and, you know, just like there were movements at that time, you know, to combat fascism, and there were class struggles, and people were building solidarity between one country and another country on the issue of class struggle. So she wanted solidarity between women all over the world, and actually she did create an organization called Sisterhood is Global, and I was on the board of it for a few years. And it's wonderful to see how she was trying to knit it together even in her last days, and looking for female solidarity to be able to cut through all of this. And I think the Me Too movement now enables us to do that a bit. Because, you know, it's in America, it's in India, it's in Europe, it's in France, it's in different countries. Some women are challenging it, some are part of it. There's enormous sympathy, you know, also enormous normalization for women of their situation, so very hard to take it on. And of course, many of the victims of the Me Too movement who have been identified as perpetrators are from the left. And the reason is that while left movements have tackled class inequality and talked about it at least and tried to tackle it, they have never addressed gender. They have been very uncomfortable in addressing gender. And you know, I have had friends who were in the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa who said, I leave gender issues behind when I enter my home, because if I will have to get up and cook and make sure the house is warm and friendly and all of that. So there are issues which the left, the women on the left were ready to confront because they had anyway got the conversation going at home about inequality. Whereas the men on the right have not been labeled in an equal measure as perpetrators in the Me Too movement because their women are much more suppressed. They don't even have the vocabulary and the language of talking about inequality, and that is why we have inordinate numbers of left-wing men who are being accused rather than more right-wing men. The suppression is so much greater that they haven't even reached the point where they can speak up. The other thing about Simone, which I wanted to talk about, is that she also gave us the vocabulary to challenge things which were taboo. And that courage that we have right now is so brilliant. You know, she challenged the glorification of marriage. And she said, what's so great about marriage? And remember, this is a woman. She challenged the sacredness. She defended abortion. She defended contraception. You know, so these are things, imagine, here's a young woman in the 1940s growing up in a Catholic home. And she's going out and defending abortion and contraception. She's saying marriage, and she's living openly with all her various lovers. And, you know, she says, what's so great about marriage? The institution is stacked to perpetuate patriarchy. And this is in the 1940s. A Catholic girl. And this is what she's doing. And today, you know, we do challenge it and we do say it, but you know the struggles we have to challenge these two things. Even today, women are still silent about an abortion they have. They find it difficult to speak about it. They'll hide it, not talk about it, feel guilty about it. Similarly, every woman will say, let me go through marriage once. If I find the ideal mate, great. If I don't, at least I will have experienced it once. So, it's still a struggle, but at least we've made some strides. In the fact that we're talking, we can laugh and we can also reject, There is something. But the idea of challenging things, breaking taboos, was so brilliant. And I feel, I don't know if it's, I feel that Simone must have heard about what was going on in Germany through the resistance movements at that time. And I'm going back to that period because it is such a critical period for us to understand. One of the reasons that fascism came to power in Germany and Hitler came to power in Germany was the backlash to feminism in the Weimar Republic. Remember, the Weimar Republic had really emancipated women. They had the vote even before America or any of the European countries did. There were women in parliament in Weimar. Women were cutting their hair short. Their dresses were becoming shorter. They were no longer wearing the long gowns. They were demanding childcare. They were demanding equal wages. Berlin was called a city of sin because women were emancipated. So when the word corruption was used, one of this was that because women were out of the house and going around in public. And what did Hitler tell everybody, every soldier returning back from the First World War? He said that, you lost the First World War because you lost your masculinity. And why did you lose your masculinity? You lost your masculinity because you allowed women to escape. The family broke down. And so I will restore. And he used this very chilling phrase. He said, I will restore family values. And what was the first thing he did? And this resonated with all the men. And he said he used something called the 3 Ks. The Kinder, the Kirche, and the Kitchen. Kinder means children. Kirche is church. And kitchen is kitchen. And he said, I will restore this. And he did. He passed law after law. So the first people in Auschwitz were women who had tried to have an abortion. Feminist women who were asking for more rights. They were the ones in Auschwitz. The second thing he did was he cancelled all higher education for women in universities. He murdered someone called Rosa Luxemburg. I don't know if you've heard about her in your generation, but she was fighting for rights and all of that. So probably Simone is hearing all this when she's writing The Second Sex and feels even more strongly that I have to make a statement for women's rights. Because women's rights are being crushed. There were girls, 15-year-old girls, blonde, blue-eyed, who were told that they have to be sexually available to produce babies, not just for Mein Herr, the Führer, but also for all the Hitler youth who would just come and rape them. There were places called Lebensbrauns where they were just sent to produce Nazi babies. So it's very similar to something going on now. Try and notice and draw parallels.
Apologies for the interruption. We have Mr. Saikat Majumdar here finally. So can we please welcome him?
Hi, apologies for being so late, but I've been waiting for an hour. There was some misunderstanding about the car, I think, but I'm glad I'm finally here. But in a way, I'm happy because I go to so many gatherings and festivals, and most of the time I hear men speaking, and women tend to be quieter. And I teach in a university, and often it's very easy to get men to speak. But so I think it's fitting that men shut up and listen, for all like this. And I'm glad that I did come late. That being said, I have to say that I've been rereading this amazing book in preparation for this event, and the first thing it strikes me, it's such an epic sweep. I mean, she covers everything. The ambition of the book is really incredible. History, geography, science. It's just something almost Platonic about it. And a couple of things. There's so much to talk about, but I want to focus on just a few things. One amazing thing is, I'm just going to quote a little passage I sort of singled out. She points out, Simone really draws attention to the fact that this otherness, the gendered otherness, is very different from racial otherness or class otherness. She's actually incredibly sensitive to the fact that, what it means to be American Negro, what it means to be a Jew. And this was actually a problem with much 60s feminism, which was picked up by, working class women or women from the third world, that, this is very white bourgeois feminism. Rereading this book, it strikes me that she's actually exceedingly sensitive of the fact that in many ways, being a woman sort of compares to being a black and a Jew. And the Jewish question keeps coming back. And yet, there's a very important difference, and that's what I want to point to. I think she's something about, one can dream of things like the atomic bomb and making humanity wholly Jewish or black. But woman cannot even dream of exterminating the males. The bond that unites her to her oppressors is not comparable to any other. The division of the sexes is a biological fact, not an event in human history. And that is incredibly important. I mean, and this is something I've always found, the women's question, the feminist struggle is actually different from class struggle, from racial struggle, from post-colonial struggles, because it happens primarily in the private sphere. That it is sort of inseparable to intimacy of a kind. To put it very simply, if you want, you may not want to interact with somebody of a different race or a different class, or even if you do, you're in a power position. Now, this otherness is one kind where it doesn't matter who you are, what your sexual orientation, you are in an intimate relationship with the opposite sex. And that makes it very different. That makes, to put it simply, it's a kind of a simplification, but the struggle, the feminist struggle has to happen in the public as well as the private sphere. Whereas other forms of struggle can predominantly happen in the public sphere. They can also happen in the private sphere. There are, of course, things like interracial relationships. There are things like, something like in India, the issue of domestic service, which enters into the interpersonal sphere. But still, this is, inescapably personal. And of course, the personal as political has been a war cry of feminists forever. And this is something which appeals to me tremendously as a writer and a thinker. I'm really drawn to the kind of personal stories of politics, the kind of politics which Michel Foucault has kind of made us aware to, the kind of power relations that exist in personal life, the power relation of the kitchen rather than the parliament. As a writer, I've always been more interested in the power relation and the gossip of the neighborhood than mainstream television. And this is a lesson that is given to us by feminists, and Simone is really crucial, in this matter. The thing is, there's so many things that come from her. Another very important debate, which I think we'll never really solve, is the question of essentialism. Is there something essential about being a woman? And again, Simone repeatedly brings up the issue, is there something essential about being Jewish? Is blackness a certain kind of timeless thing? Thinkers like Hegel had, all kinds of disturbing ideas about it. What does blackness mean? Is it a state of historicism? And what does it mean? Is it something to celebrate? Is it, and this is a really paradoxical and incredibly complicated point, because again, I think the second wave feminism, people like Kristeva and Sigzu really celebrated a certain essentialism, that to be a woman, to speak like a woman, a certain kind of language, a certain kind of rhythm is fundamentally different from being a man. And later generation of Anglo-American feminists have taken issue with that, that no, this is a kind of essentialism, that all women, and my favorite example of that is a writer on whom I've done some work, James Joyce. And James Joyce and Helen Sigzu actually did her dissertation on James Joyce. Yeah. Okay. Oh, sorry, yeah. And, the famous thing was, Sigzu said, oh, Joyce's Ulysses, the last chapter, Molly Bloom's Reverie, is like the ultimate female discourse. It's the celebration. And the second generation of feminists really celebrated that. But if you look at, Joyce's letters, Joyce's wife, Nora Barnacle, was really a kind of half-literate peasant woman, and that's how she used to write those letters to Joyce. And Joyce has this passage in a letter written to his brother Stanislaus Joyce, where he says, oh, this is how women think. And wow, this is how women think. I mean, you take a sentence written by a woman who's really barely literate and you basically club all womankind in that. And to what degree the character of Molly Bloom is actually created out of this understanding of how women think is extremely disturbing. But this is exactly, I think, in many ways traceable to second wave feminism, on which Simone was a pioneering influence. It was really key. I mean, that being said, it is almost impossible to cast essentialism fully aside. That is there something really like a woman? And this is, something, her famous kind of bumper sticker of this book because like one is not born but becomes a woman, and this of course Judith Butler and others have taken up in a very significant way. One is not born, it's difference between sex and gender. You can born with a sex, but gender is constructed. So this is something, and this is something we can't dismiss very easily, because just to think of other forms of otherness, pun fully intended, is I'm thinking of when Dipesh Chakravarti and the subaltern historians talks of, do tribals think differently? When tribals imagine history, is it different from a bourgeois model of imagining history? Chakravarti repeatedly says that it's not just, writing a democratic history is not just simply including those who are left out. It is we have to do something to throw the discipline of history into crisis. The very mode of thinking must be different. And his favorite example is religion. So history is written with a very post-enlightenment modern sensibility where, superstition, magic, myth has no place. Now, how do you include some other form where magic and myth are really important? So when the nationalist historian writes that, the Santal, thought that the God will fight for him. But of course, God doesn't really fight. So there's rationalization. So the point is, the point I'm trying to make is that there are essentialist differences. There are essentialist differences which can be celebrated. But essentialist differences should not be used also, as a way of kind of blanketing everything else. So this is Simone's legacy. She really throws this question into relief, that is there fundamentally something about being a woman, and which again Sigzu and Christopher Oates call a feminine form of discourse. And many of you must have read Sigzu's Laugh of the Medusa, where she really the kind of broken sentences, the lack of punctuation, the orality, the kind of very bodily nature, kind of echoes. Have you heard how a woman speaks? Have you heard? And of course, sitting in a meeting like that, you kind of become uneasy about that thing right there. But there was something to celebrate that, and much of that really owes it to Simone. And it's this, and the most fascinating thing, when any kind of political ideology becomes really powerful, it becomes invisible. Most famously, that is true of power. And I think, in a sense, that's where Simone de Beauvoir's Second Sex is. It is almost every discourse we talk. We are, like somebody said, that as human beings, we are Aristotelians if we know it or not. And as feminists, men or women, we are her followers, because it has become like the air we breathe. So I'll stop there and maybe let others continue.
I think Saikat's question of essentialism is very central to, as you said, the legacy of Beauvoir. And I think, Ruchira was also indicating that because she has this whole section on lesbianism and lesbian loves. And I think queer studies owes a huge debt to her in both respects, theoretically and also in bringing it up, breaking those taboos and being able to talk about it, and being able to talk about it in completely personal terms, because she, of course, had many, many women lovers as well. So I think this whole question of gender as socially constructed is very central to how we understand queer studies, how we understand trans studies, how we understand masculinity studies, because I think, again, an important contribution that we don't acknowledge that much is in her autobiography. It's not in The Second Sex, but The Second Sex indicates in All Said and Done, which is the last volume, I think, of her autobiography, four-volume autobiography. She actually says, the same sentence from Second Sex. One is, you are not born a man, you become one. So just as women are not born women, there's a process of becoming, and the process of becoming is really social, through socialization. Similarly, men are socialized in a particular kind of way. So which I think is the premise of masculinity studies as we practice it now. So I think a lot of the stuff that we do academically, disciplines that we have created, actually sort of stem from this questioning of essence. This breaking of taboos as well. So I think that's very important. I think, again, Ruchira also flagged that very important question of Simone's life. And you also said, this making political the personal, which is central to radical feminism. Radical feminism comes, some 20 years later, from The Second Sex. But I think she's what I started talking about right at the beginning, which is the self-scrutiny that she's constantly engaged in, the writing of the autobiographies, which is a way of politicizing her own life. And if we look at the second sex as her sort of political testimony or epic, I think it has to be read alongside, how she's constantly sort of deriving much of what she's saying from her own life and from her own experiences. So I think that remains very important. And I think as young people, I don't know, for me the most exciting thing, even when I hadn't read The Second Sex, for me the most exciting thing was her life. So the fact, and her relationship with Sartre, the fact not just that she didn't marry, she chose not to marry, but also the fact that she completely rejected domesticity. She had a horror of maternity, and she talked about these things, in a context. As Ruchira, thank you so much for setting that context. In a time when motherhood was being celebrated, domesticity was being, because this was the post-war era. And, many, many men had died in the war. And, there was a sort of job of repopulating the world, it was happening in America, it was happening in Europe. So, women were being asked to, go and produce more children. And this was very much the 40s. And you talked about abortion. I mean, as late as 43 or 44, a woman was guillotined for performing abortion. So, Latour. Yeah, but guillotine, I mean, how?
Women are jailed in
For
having an abortion.
Yeah, so I mean, it's extraordinary when you think in that light what she's talking about. And her, in The Second Sex, she's absolutely unambiguous about her rejection of maternity. And she says that, why are we sort of valuing this? The reproductive function in many ways traps me into the body of the woman and doesn't allow me to be, the person I want. A lot of radical feminists have sort of opposed this and have said, she's sort of calumniating motherhood, etc. And she struggled with things like jealousy. I mean, as feminists, we can't even talk about sexual jealousy. We feel embarrassed to talk about it. And she wasn't. I mean, she had that capacity to be able. So again, because we didn't talk about her fiction, and I was wondering if you want to do that. So she has, several novels. For instance, for me, again, when I read She Came to Stay, The Mandarins, but more She Came to Stay, which is based on L'Invité, which is this novel that she wrote about a three-way relationship that she and her pupil, her female pupil, had. So it was her student, and Sartre was sort of having an affair with her, and she was part of it, a kind of ménage à trois, and how difficult it was. And, this whole theory of existential freedom is being asserted, sweating blood. She's asserting her theory and her philosophy, but it's based on life experience. And that, I think the materiality of that theory is extraordinary because she's living through it and she's paying the cost for it. Every day she's paying the price for it because she is consumed by jealousy, but she also realizes that in order to be free, she has to somehow transcend that. So I think she's extraordinary sort of text when you actually locate it within the kind of things that she's doing. Last words, and then
I think maybe we can just open up to questions now because we won't have time.
Yeah, I don't know if this has come up before, but one question also was her relationship with labor. I think she talks a lot about that, and this is as Paromita has pointed out, that this was a very crucial time of kind of world building and nation building, and she's very aware of the fact that women are a threat to men in the workplace, and not least because they are often willing to accept lower wages. And is also, these are also issues which are so much with us even today, the perpetual relevance of it, and also fascinating how these issues translate and kind of go beyond their immediate context and, goes things with, immigration and migrant labor and other forms of, and what is really interesting is, and of course the word seminal itself is so problematic, right here, because that shows that to what degree patriarchy is deep in our language, a word which actually originates from, the same origin as semen, right? I mean, that is, It's sort of the whole idea that seminars.
Which is a word we should not use.
So we should call it symposium, which is a drunken party, right? That is more acceptable. We should have a symposium, drunken, yeah, revelry. But my point is, I mean, again, I think we need to reinvent language, and we need to have what would be a gender-sensitive equivalent of the word seminal. I mean, I want to call her seminal, but of course, no, I mean, yeah, but
for a very long time what radical meant. That's why she's saying that.
Roots,
Because we said radical does not mean extreme. According to the dictionary definition, it means going to the root.
Right.
And we say that the fundamentals of all inequality begins at home, where we learn that it's all right for one class of human beings to order and one class of human beings to obey, and how gender digs a trench into our brain into which all other inequalities fall. Because we observe it at home and then we go out and normalize it.
Absolutely, absolutely. But seminal also in the sense which creates... Yeah, inaugural, exactly. Inaugural, maybe. I mean, that is pioneering. Yeah, I mean, it's. I mean, really, this trailblazing. Yeah, I mean, the word seminal is actually so powerful and so disturbing at the same time, because you realize my point is, these categories of oppression, these questions that Simone raised, are strikingly resonant across so many other power differentials. And yet, I think there is one unique kind of unrelenting difference in the question of intimacy and privacy. And how do you fight someone you love? How do you fight someone with whom you're inextricably bonded, tied, mutual? And that, I think, makes it a very different kind of struggle. And as Paromita pointed out so well, and her relationship with Satra, actually embodies this. She had this thing, I mean, I think a relationship with Satra, and I think I read somewhere that only in relation to him did she think herself as secondary. And of course, it's not just a man, it's Satra. So there's also that question. But, this intimacy is at the same time so bitter. This feeling has so many other aspects. This intimacy is so painful. To be intimate, it's literally sleeping with the enemy. So this is the challenge, I think, for feminist struggles, it will remain forever. And I think Simone's life is especially, striking because she lived this life, as you reminded us so well. And, it was a public struggle which was waged on the private front. And that, I think, is remarkably hard to do. We can all talk about class, we can all talk about race, and we keep it at a distance. We don't have to go to bed with it. But this is something we have to go to bed with, and she was going to bed with it, and that struggle shows.
So we are opening it now to questions, and yeah, we'd love to have some questions.
And if you can keep your questions short, because we have very limited time for the questions. Yeah?
I had a few statements. If it's okay, I had a few statements from what I've heard. Questions might come out of it. I'm from Canada. I spend a lot of time in India. Okay, from the lady in the middle, what you said about Simone being, I would call a trailblazer in my term, having the courage to speak her truth. I think we need to teach young women this, to tune into themselves, to know what their truths are, and then have the correct language to speak them. I'm finding it works very well. Within your own culture, you have to learn that. Why can't we all have the courage to speak our truth? And then, Ruchira, what you were saying earlier, talking about Nazi Germany, the United States is Canada's border, and we're very concerned what's going on with Trump. And this history is repeating itself in reversing Roe, which is the abortion issue in the United States, and just everything that's going on there. It's a backlash to feminism, and it's very scary. So I want to hear more about that.
Yes, so basically, the point I was making was that one of the reasons why Hitler came to power was that he cashed in to the backlash to the emancipation of women just after the First World War. And Weimar Republic was called corrupt because it had emancipated women in such a big way. Women were in parliament, women were in the workplace, they were cutting their hair, their dress was becoming shorter, they were demanding more equality. And you know, what Hitler did very clearly was to say that I will restore family values. And the reason that Germany lost the First World War was because the men were emasculated. And the reason they were emasculated was because they let the women free. And so he would make sure the women returned to the kinder, the kirche, and the kitchen. And the first things that he did when he came to power was precisely that. So he actually banned higher education for women. He created something called the Lebensbrauns, where women had to produce Nazi babies, or you know, the superior race Aryan babies, and had to be sexually available for Hitler Youth. He banned abortion, and so women were put into jail for abortion. I'm talking about, he banned mixed race marriages because he said this, you know, there was eugenics. So he was checking, you know, how the right races would marry each other and produce the right baby. And then he was demanding that exactly what Paromita spoke about, that women produce, produce, produce. And there were women who were completely besotted with Hitler and who would write letters to him saying, I've had a fourth child for you, mein Führer. And he writes himself in his writings, he says, being a bachelor was very useful for him because he could appeal to this sexual fervor among women. So there are many parallels between what's going on in the United States and in India too, between how, you know, there's an appeal to this sort of toxic masculinity to regain some kind of power and then connect it to nationhood and all of that. And the crushing of women in the process. So in America, of course, you hear the Roe versus Wade judgment and how, you know, they want to reverse the right for women to have abortion. But also in America, you know, the president can call someone slut and bitch and all who is a competitor of equal stature. And, you know, textbooks being rewritten, even there. And same thing is happening in India. I don't know if you know, but in our budget of 2017, budgets were cut for gender study centers and women's study centers in all universities across our country. Again, we have members of parliament who say each woman should have 4 children. I don't know how fascists arrive at the number 4, because that's exactly what Germany, Hitler also always said, that 4 children. Every woman, every Aryan woman should have 4 children. And similarly, the role of the woman, you know, that how, the kind of clothes she should wear, what she should do. In fact, you know, we have this huge debate about Sabrimala now, that, you know, should women wear a sanitary pad and go inside a temple or not, you know. Being turned into an evocative image that would you go for dinner waving a blood-dripping sanitary pad, but nobody's waving one. People are wearing one, you know, it's very different. So we have similar issues, the banning of intercaste and interreligious marriages, you know, to produce this child or this baby of superior upper caste Hindu genes. Also something called Garbha Sanskar, which is an RSS program, which is a shot at eugenics to do this. There are actually baby camps to do that. And, you know, women being told that the safest place is home, not to go out at night, not to wear the wrong clothes, not to use cell phones. There are colleges banning it, and impunity for rapists very publicly. You know, so there's Hadia, who's banned for marrying across religion and kept at home for a long time till the Supreme Court intervenes. But there is also Asifa, who is killed, an 8-year-old girl who's raped and murdered. And yet, you know, her rapists are being defended by people who are from the elected party, saying they're from the same religion, so they cannot be punished. And the lawyer who's fighting for Asifa's family is blocked, not, you know, every time she goes out by a political rally. So this kind of thing is very much like what began in Germany a long time ago, like Freikorps, you know. So it's very, very similar and very scary. And basically, women are going to bear the brunt of this pushback. And same thing with Trump. If you look at his election slogan, it's exactly what the election slogan is: domestic violence. What does he say? Lock her up. And that's exactly what men say when women are trying to escape from home when they're victims of domestic violence. They take away the keys, they take away the credit card, the car keys and all of that and say, lock her up. It's very similar.
Yeah, this question at the back.
Now, you spoke about women loving their oppressors, but what about the mother-son relationship? Because the mother should have some power over the son and influence him properly.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, safe mother and son. Yeah. Of course, when I talked about intimate bond, I didn't just mean the romantic or the sexual relation. I meant intimate bond across, all, because that would be assuming heterosexual, heteronormative culture. The mother-son relationship, well, talk of epics. There's another one right there. I mean, I don't even want to enter into the whole Freudian sort of, forest there with Oedipal. But I think it's very difficult. I mean, there are these, whether they're sexual overtones, there's sexual undertones in the mother-son relationship, has been the subject of. But I think it's very interesting. I've heard, even in an anecdotal way, that many young mothers say that a small son and a daughter love very differently. They love very differently. A son takes, and a daughter. And these are very interesting points because I've been, I actually have two small children, a 9-year-old daughter and a 4-year-old son, and it's been fascinating. I've been really fascinated watching things like, when is gender ideological? What part? Even simple things like, I notice the obsession with fans in male children. The obsession with wheels, is it really male? I mean, how can it be ideological if at the age of 6 months he's staring at the fan, but the daughter is absolutely not interested? So, I mean, kind of really on a kind of hunt to find out which part, where is the becoming? When is the being and when is the becoming? Because there are, of course, questions of being, of course, there are physical factors. And then there are questions of becoming. When does one see? And it's so hard to avoid the becoming because they observe gender roles everywhere, no matter how sensitive you want to be, no matter how, and the world is diffuse, so they observe everywhere. And I think, this is one of those tough questions where biology, nature meets nurture. And it's impossible to draw the distinction. When does nature end and when does nurture begin? But it is true that there's something, I mean, the thing about that mother's statement is that, the son just takes, and then after a certain age, I've heard when they grow to a certain age, they leave and go away. And it's, again, anecdotally, so much of, literature, fiction, film, there's a representation, is that, is after a certain age, is the daughter who's taking care, who's much more caring than the son. There's a certain, so all these things are, we observe them, and it's impossible to say how much of that is, sort of organic or natural, if there's anything like that at all, or if it's learned behavior, because everything is, all around us. And do you want to?
Just because I heard that as part of your question, which was mothers teaching sons. And this whole question of parenting and dual parenting, and because a lot of the early childhood nurture is done by mothers, whether it's a girl or a boy. If fathers get involved in early childhood times, then what difference could happen from that in terms of gendering? I mean, those are questions that I think are quite relevant. But the other thing, because I think it came up after the Jyoti Singh episode, which is this question that mothers should teach their sons better. But I think why should the onus always be on the mother? I mean, I think Beauvoir forces us to ask this question. I mean, is everything to do with the mother? I mean, please, place the onus somewhere else. Place it on society, place it on fathers. I don't know. I mean, mothers can't do everything, please.
Actually, I want to add to what Paromita said, because we've had this conversation earlier too, a few years ago. But basically, there is the possibility of role reversal now. And, with technology, with science, we already have surrogacy, and, anybody can deliver a baby. And also, perhaps evolution means that men will start breastfeeding. And will that change how we see men? and also change the relationship between mother and child and father and child. You know, if one person is always told that you are the breadwinner and the other person always told you are the caregiver, and then you have to live out that role for the rest of your life. What if it's reversed and the child sees that, you know, it can be fluid? It can also lead to gender fluidity, which means power fluidity, right? And things can change. So there is a possibility, but on the mother-son relationship, why do mothers, you know, allow their sons to have more power over their sisters or over their wives whenever they can play a role in the situation? I think it is the subjected colonial, you know, it's like the colonial subject. Why did the colonial subject participate in trammeling other people who were Indians below them? You want to become part of the power hierarchy, but somewhere with more consciousness, this is changing, and I think you know, the possibility of role reversal will change it even more.
Anecdotal evidence of this actually happening, I've heard. I know a couple, and he's a writer, and she's an academic, and so he mostly works from home. And so one day, and they have a daughter, and she comes back from school and says, I've heard the most weird thing in school, men going to office. Children na ke office jai. You know, because she always sees her father working at home. And along with that, her mother is the one who drives, and he doesn't like to drive. In the same way, children na ke gari chalai. You know, so, you know, you can see that, you know, it's really about what she's grown up watching, you know, that her mother always drives. So things can change.
Ma'am, so as you had said, Simone hadn't realized till a certain point of time in her life that she was a woman. And what I see around me is a lot of times when girls hit puberty and they realize they're girls, they have to act a certain way. So ma'am, what do you think that, you know, which is more conducive to becoming a feminist? That you realize you're a woman or you don't?
This is actually a very profound question. Thank you for it. Yeah, because I don't think Simone didn't realize she was a woman. What she says is, I didn't think that it made a difference to my life chances, to the opportunities I had, to what I could access, to the resources that were given to me or not given to me. So she feels that that's not something that decides her fate. It's not her destiny, womanhood. It's only much later that she comes to acknowledge it, when she's about 40. And she says that, you know, since age 20 till this time, I've never actually felt that being a woman or being a man makes any difference to your life chances. So that's the question. I mean, she knew she was a woman. It's not like she had a sexual anxiety or identity crisis. It wasn't that, but it's just that she didn't think it was an important aspect of her identity. One. Two is, what you're talking about is really the at the heart of feminism. Because on the one hand, if we look at liberal feminism, it's always tried to create a situation where you're talking about equality without difference. So equality as sameness. So a woman should become more and more like a man in order to access all the life chances that a man has. So if I don't have political rights, give me political rights. If I don't have education, give me education. And eventually I will become like you, and, you know. So that's the liberal feminist position, where my being a woman has to be continuously erased for me to become equal. So, you know, sex becomes unimportant. But then the radical feminists said, why should we do that? Why should we become more and more masculine in order to access rights? So what they are saying is different but equal. So we will assert our difference, even in essential ways, perhaps. Some radical feminists do. But that should not stop us from accessing rights. So these are two central. So how we look at sexual difference as an impediment to equality, or as something that we should get equality anyway. I mean, difference should not stand in the way. Because if we are talking about rights for all, then why is difference? Because if we once acknowledge that, you know, difference can stand in the way of rights, then, you know, where does it put black people or Jewish people? Then they can't be Jewish in order to have human rights. Yeah. So this is a difficult question. It's a debate, but I think it's very central to feminism, and I think you've hit the nail on the head.
And also, just to clarify, when Simone says that one is not born woman but becomes woman, what she doesn't mean is biologically. She's talking about that how we normalize inequality. And that, how women are made unequal, and that is how she's defining woman in this sentence, in this particular phrase. But she always knows that she's female, and there is difference in the way she's brought up. She writes, if you read a book of hers where she challenges religion and spirituality, things of the spirit, she's talking about like what's going on, how she's sent to a different school. The Catholic schools for girls were much more limited than the elite schools that Sartre went to. So, she knows there are limitations. She knows that she wants to not go to a salon, for example. She wants to join literary circles in Paris. She also at some points knows that she's compromising when she says Sartre is the original philosopher and she's going to be a literary critic. Why does she make these compromises? She knows somewhere her inequality is being created as she's growing up, and therefore it has brought her to a certain condition where she cannot compete equally. Which is why then she goes on to write a manifesto like this, to say that there is a possibility, and she makes her entire life she devotes to show, as personal as political, that it can be challenged, even at every cost to herself, I'm sure, while she was living. So it just opens pathways for us to understand what was going on. And feminism, you don't realize when you're biologically born female, you do realize how unequal the world is. So if I'm told that I have to learn how to cook and my brother is not, I find it irritating. So maybe that sparks feminism in me, that why should I, when I tell my mother, or when I tell someone, you're not the boss of me. That's the spark of feminism. I might be saying it as a 12-year-old to my brother, my father, somebody, right? So the first challenge of inequality makes us realize that, and it's the same for men too, because men can be feminists too. That's a very fundamental thing that you have to understand. And all they have to believe in very deeply is that the full equality between men and women, right? So, and there are so many now other sexual permutations and combinations which can happen. The other thing, when someone was talking about mother-son relationship, the one thing I forgot, one of the reasons possibly why, we have so much misogyny and why, men resent women and take it out in different ways with so much male sexual violence and other kinds of violence too against women, just because they are women, things like femicide, female infanticide, etc., is possibly because, the first female authority that men see, the first authority that men have to encounter is female authority. And they begin to resent authority. So if there's role reversal, then that will equalize it too.
So we are just on to one last question before we can wind up.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Rudrani. And my question stemmed from Beauvoir's kind of focus on solidarity as being a very important focus. So I just wanted to ask you that in the context of the current feminist movement, how important do you think solidarity, especially solidarity with men, is? Because there is a general criticism that the current gender movements are very alienating of men. So where would you place that entire narrative of solidarity with men? Thank you.
Do you want to direct the question at someone, or do you want all three of us to answer it? Okay, one by one. Saikat, why don't you start then? And we'll all keep it short so we can finish.
I think, this whole idea of patriarchy as an ideology is important to understand. It is not, patriarchy is not just about men. Just the way feminism is not just about women, but it's a way of thinking. It's kind of an ontological thing. It's about ideology. And again, we owe a lot to Michel Foucault for our understanding of this kind of power. That, of course, we all know that some of the most toxic perpetrators of patriarchy can be women, right? Just the way there are feminist men, there can be patriarchal women. And of course, probably the most infamous and trivial at the same time example of that is the Sas-Bahu relationship, which I think is the subject of many television soaps, the proverbial mother-in-law thing. And it's many parts of North India, the female infanticide or feticide urge often comes from the mother-in-law, the idea that we have to. So, what I'm trying to say is that, of course, there's no question that who you are has a lot to do with what ideology you subscribe to, but already on the other side of the divide, it has already transcended. That is, don't count on all women being part of the feminist struggle. In the same way, it's also true that, you know, there are men, and of course, you know, I guess I'm sitting on this panel right now, so in some senses, at least, it's my I'm part of this conversation right now, and it was important to have, I guess, a man in this conversation. It's you know, and because it is true. I mean, I do feel though it is important for man to take a back seat. It's important for men to listen because, as I said, you know, which is why I was celebrating my late arrival, as it were, in this, that men have spoken too long, men have been active for too long, and it's, you know, I really do believe in, a book I really love a lot is Virginia Woolf's Three Guineas, and that amazing book. I truly believe, I sort of believe in the vision she outlines. If women led the world, it would actually be a much better place. It really would be. I mean, which war has ever been started by a woman? This is Woolf's point, and which violence has ever, I mean, which is of that scale. So I do believe in those things, that there are some ways, you know, that just things are just better. So I hope in that way we can transcend who we are in terms of our identity to a certain way of thinking. And remember, this can cut both ways. That is both a kind of a wonderful strength, but a dangerous possibility. So.
I think we spoke about this before as well, because Bova was very clear that she did not think of men as the enemy at all. And her initial sort of vision of women's autonomy or women's freedom was very individualistic. It wasn't about sisterhood. She comes to the idea of sisterhood. She arrives at the idea of solidarity much later in life in the 1970s. And in fact, a lot of radical feminists have criticized her for being a liberal feminist because, you know, her vision of freedom was very individualistic. And she herself realized that it's also very bourgeois, because she says that for a middle-class woman to access paid work and then, you know, achieve some kind of autonomy is a vision that I had because, you know, it applied to me and it was part of my experience. But, you know, for working women, for peasant women, to access paid work is on top of, you know, the burden of domestic work, and she talks about that. And that does not offer any autonomy. It's yet another burden. So she again, you know, that's a journey that she traverses. And she comes finally to this notion that probably the socialist revolution which will be fought by men, will not bring autonomy for women. Women will have to fight this battle themselves, perhaps, through sisterhood, through solidarities. But this is not her initial, I mean, definitely not the vision in the second sex either. She is ambivalent about that sisterhood issue because she's still very hopeful that men will fight that battle alongside her. I think later on she sort of becomes much more suspicious of that possibility.
I'll just answer in one sentence because I think some profound thoughts have already been shared by both Saikat and Paromita. But basically, what about when we think about solidarity between women, of course, because we are unequal, so we become stronger if there's solidarity. And the Me Too movement is a real case study in that because, you know, I actually, the Me Too movement began at my dining table in New York. So Ashley Judd was a very close friend of mine, and she's been coming and staying with me in India and in New York when she comes to New York, and telling me about the horror stories of Hollywood. And I had a few other friends in Hollywood, and they would tell me the same. So I would be having lunch in Soho House, and Rosanna Arquette would say, "Don't look to your right, you know, Harvey Weinstein is sitting there. And if he knows we are talking about ending prostitution, he'll kill us." So I said, "Why are you so scared of him?" And she would say how her career had been affected. So I would keep telling all these women, Mira Sorvino, Patricia Arquette, Rosanna Arquette, Ashley, why don't you speak up? And they said, it'll mean if we speak up that we will lose our endorsements, movie contracts. These are powerful people we are taking up. And I said, we've got to challenge power. And then what happened was the tipping point. Trump got elected. And, you know, all of us were very angry that how did this happen? Someone so misogynist, so blatantly anti-women got elected. And Ashley came to Calcutta, and she was here for a month, going to Sonagachi every day, where women were sharing their stories with her with great courage. And so she comes back to New York and is staying with me. And at night she says, "Ruchira, I'm ready to tell my story." So to talk about solidarity, I immediately phoned Mira Sorvino and Rosanna Arquette and Patricia Arquette, and I said, now we've got to do this together. So everyone has to break the story together at the same time. So what it'll build credibility, and it will give strength to Ashley as the whole story unfolds. So the next day, Jodie Cantor from New York Times came home, and I called her. She immediately came with pastries and flowers. I'm arranging the flowers while Ashley is telling the story. And the same thing happened. Rosanna called up Ronan Farrow, the other guy who broke the story, and Mira Sorvino. So the solidarity helped in making sure that Harvey Weinstein and others like him could not say it did not happen. There were enough women, one after another, who spoke up, and enough women to support them as the story unfolded. And these women were not hiding behind anonymity. They knew they might lose movie contracts. Ashley, in fact, has lost movie contracts and endorsements. I know this. So there is a financial backlash, but she did it, and she spoke up. And then that movement came to India, and I know that now people are speaking up and all of that. And there's a big debate going on that, you know, how true is it? What about the false accusation? And I think it's important that, of course, there will be false accusations, but there will be real accusations too. So, you know, the men who want to build solidarity with this movement, they have to come forward and support the women who are speaking up, rather than talking about the one false accusation and asking us to analyze and give a response to that. And finally, the one way to take this forward, the male-female solidarity, female-to-female solidarity, is really to think about not consensual sex, you know, because we can consent under any circumstances, right? I could consent if I'm a child bride. I could consent if my husband is the only breadwinner to having sex. I could consent because I'm a prostitute, and, you know, my brothel manager says if you don't get the money, you won't get a bed to sleep on. So there can be many reasons for consensual sex. But how about all of us shifting our frame of thinking and thinking about welcome sex? And if we welcome that sex, then we will, you know, two people will participate. It will be about two people having fun and pleasure rather than one person, and everything will change. That's the real solidarity we want.
Thank you, ma'am. So with that, thanks to all of you for the active participation, and thanks to the panelists for such an enlightened erudition. We'll wind up the discussion right now. There is a media interaction in Park Mansion lawn, and also the social media interaction in some time with the panelists. And before that, I would like to make few other short announcements. A few of our sponsors and partners for this event were supporting partner Future Publishers and Distributors, knowledge partner NSHM Knowledge Campus, institutional partner British Council and Prabha Khaitan Foundation, also Oxford University Press, food partner Food for You Premium Food Delivery, and radio partner is 91.9 Friends FM.